motion and a second?
I move items 9.1 through 9.13.
I second. So the motion has been moved and seconded. This is a roll call vote. Anjali?
Yes.
Josephine, yes. Kristen?
Yes.
Soma?
Yes.
Phyllis?
Yes.
The motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to item 10, which is a discussion information item. And we're going to talk about the May revise and the 2016-17 budget. Chris, I think this must be you.
Good evening. Happy to be here tonight. This is our annual update of the budget to the board. Tonight we'll be sharing, well actually last board meeting we had shared with you information as far as the budget and the assumptions that are going into the budget. Tonight we're going to show to you tonight the contents of the budget, how we're spending how we're budgeting our money. We'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face with the current funding model as we get closer to the possibility of a possible slowdown with the economy or potentially on the verge of another recession. So we'll talk about how those things impact the district. And then after tonight, we'll be bringing back the budget for consideration along with the LCAP at our next scheduled board meeting. So tonight, we're going to go through the budget. But before I continue any further, I do want to thank Julia, you and the business office staff for putting together again a budget year after year, a great budget all the time. It takes to take the information from all of our stakeholders, from all of our departments, our schools, our principals. Everything is taken into and put together as far as the budget tonight. So I just want to thank Julia. So, so first off with the budget, obviously we're in the midst of the current budget calendar. We've shared with you again the budget assumptions. Tonight we're going to share with you the preliminary budget. And if everything goes well, we'll have the budget adoption at our next scheduled meeting. And as we go through the rest of the budget, rest of the next school year, we'll be presenting obviously the unaudited actuals to you in September for this current fiscal year. And as it relates to 2016-17 budget itself, we'll be bringing to you 2 financial reports during the year. Those financial reports are kind of a snapshot to share with the board and obviously show to the County Office of Education that we are able to meet all of our fiscal obligations as far as fiscal solvency goes. So this calendar just kind of shows you all the dates. Let me just first start off by saying, you know, it's now been 9 years. It's been 9 years since we hit the recession that has hit education. Those of us remember 2006, 2007, so we're 9 years now past that. And I would say that for the last couple of years, we've been feeling the effects of a recession. We have started to see a lot of the money that was taken away from education now come back to us, restored. School districts have been able to put things back that they had to cut. So we are, I would say, in obviously a much better place, and we're getting closer and closer to the plan to fully restore us back to our pre-recession levels. I apologize, I joke about this a little bit. I mean, bringing us back to our pre-recession levels of 07, 08, and it now being 2016, almost 2017, we are still so far behind the times, so far behind as far as funding education. I think we were probably still at the time in 2006-07, ranked like 45th in the state as far as funding. And so I don't think we've made any improvements on that, unfortunately. But I think the fact of the matter is, I think with the economy and how it's affected the finances for our school district, things have gotten better. And so I want to just point out is that, you know, obviously the budget is built upon some assumptions that, and the administration is very clear about that. I mean, the governor and the legislature have said that, you know, there's the impending threat of a potential slowdown or the possibility of the next recession. It's been that long, and as we all understand, things go through cyclical periods of time. And so those are some of the things that the state budget, as well as our budget, are built upon some of those assumptions, because one good example is, you know, this year, with the economy the way it is currently right now, what we were thinking that we were going to get in the form of a COLA was very small. It was back in January estimated just to be a 0.47%. Now with the governor's May revise, they've lowered that down. They've lowered that down to 0. And so this is probably the second time in the last 10 years where we've had a zero COLA. Actually, no. Actually, we had a negative year. We had a negative COLA. I think back then we were calling that year the un-COLA year. But the fact of the matter is we're not getting any COLA for this coming year. So what does that mean? What it means is that we have to make do with literally the same amount of funding that we have, give and take, the changes with the number of students that we have. So everything kind of points right now towards concerns with whether or not the current economy can continue to sustain its ability to continue to close that gap, that funding gap, the LCFF gap, at the same pace that it has been. We've been closing that gap close to like 50, 60% the last couple of years. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So as we get closer to closing that gap, even though it's a 50% closure of what's remaining, it's not a whole lot. And on top of that, if you don't get a COLA, you're closing literally the same portion of the gap that you had before. And the other big thing too we'll talk a little bit about is Proposition 30. You heard from our associations talk about the impending problem with Proposition 30 possibly will be sunsetting, and whether or not there's any thought of extending that, because that will again have an impact to us, because that creates another, again, the same problem that the state had. They had a structural deficit, a structural problem with their budget back when Proposition 30 was passed. So if that goes away, will the state's economy, will the state revenues be high enough to help offset the loss of that Proposition 30 funding? So basically with our budget, we had shared with you that we were basing our information on what we had known at the time, and we all, staff and I, we attended the School Services May Revision Workshop, and it was just about a week ago, and I thank our board members that attended. So we've had a little bit of time to revise our budget, but I just want to make note of some of the changes in our budget assumptions that we had shared with you last time. So back at the last meeting, again, we were talking about estimating a COLA for this coming year. That has now since been reduced down to 0. The gap closure rate actually has increased. We were only estimating that the gap closure rate was going to close by just a little bit more than 49%. But the gap closure rate has actually increased from almost 55%. Interesting. So at the start of 2016, we will have closed the entire gap since it was created back in 2007 by almost 96.5%. So that's good to know, because what it means is that remaining 2.5% that we have to close the rest of the gap is going to be a little harder for us as we get closer to 2020-21 is when we were supposed to be at full implementation of LCFF. We would expect to be 100% at that point in time. One other change was the one-time mandated funds. We shared with the board that, again, this year the state was going to be giving us some more one-time funds. So originally it was estimated to be about $214. It's now been increased up to $237. Before I had sent out the presentation, I had made some references in here about making some changes to our budget. The reason I'm saying this now is that because we bring to the board at this particular time of the year the budget, it doesn't give staff enough time to kind of work everything into the final budget, because we don't, obviously don't get the information as far as the May revision until the middle of the month. So we put a little pressure on the staff to do it, and we're able to do so. But I originally had shared in my presentation that we were going to come back and update that at a later date, but staff pulled it through. Staff got everything done, so they did a great job of making sure that I could share with you tonight all the updated information. 2017-18, some minor changes as well. As I mentioned, the COLA was adjusted for this year. It also got adjusted for 17-18. Got dropped down from 2.13% down to 1.11%. As you can also see, the funding gap changes for LCFF were revised. The Department of Finance still continues to be somewhat very, I guess, overly optimistic, not as conservative as school services. We continue to use school services more conservative estimate as far as the gap closure rate. And I think we'll continue to do that until we finally close that entire gap. 18-19 as well, some changes to the assumptions with the COLA, with the gap closure rate. And 18-19 is then the year we'll see what happens with Proposition 30. So we just want to put that out there, is that there is an unknown impact with Proposition 30 when by the time 2018-19 comes around. Let me grab something to drink here. I thought I'd start us off with the budget to talk about enrollment. Since our enrollment is that main factor in terms of how we generate our income, I think it's good to remind ourselves what's in store for us the next 4 to 5 years in terms of enrollment. So our demographer shared with us in January the multi-year projection of our enrollment, and as I show up here, we're going to go through a period of decline, and a quite steady decline by the time we get to 2018 and 2019. We'll have dropped close to 900 kids based on this estimate. So it's really important for us to be aware of these things, because as we anticipate for this potential decline of enrollment, we also have to make sure that the rest of our budget is in line to make sure that we are making the reductions or the changes in the areas of the budget so that we don't get into a situation where we cannot meet all of our obligations. So I just want to start off by saying that we're projecting our budget is built upon a reduction of enrollment as well as a reduction in staffing. The LCFF funding, just to share again with everyone here in the room, it's a grade level funding mechanism that provides funding for the different grade spans. We get funding in the form of a base grant, a base entitlement. We continue to receive additional funding to support class size reduction. That's in the primary grades. That's 24 students to 1 teacher. We receive some supplemental funds. There was a question about the supplemental funding that was covering some of the budgetary expenses. We receive a small portion, and just to say that because again, due to our demographics, due to the population that we have, and that's basically the number of English language learners that we have, the number of students that we have as low socially economic, as well as any students that are foster youth. Those students are then calculated into what we would call our unduplicated count, and that factor, that number, is the basis for determining how much, whether we receive supplemental money, but how much supplemental funding we receive. So our unduplicated count has actually come down. Last year we reported to the board that we were around 15.39%. We've dropped down to almost 14.6%. So what that means is we're getting a little less funding when it comes to the supplemental funding. And that basically is the funding formula for LCFF. But just to remind everyone again, with the supplemental funding, obviously districts that have higher populations of English language learners, higher population of students on free and reduced, those districts receive a greater benefit than what Cupertino would have received just because of that factor. This is the graph I've shared with you before, just to kind of give you a sense in terms of how, as we look at our enrollment, whether it's, increasing, decreasing, staying flat, how it relates to how much we're receiving in terms of funding. So up on the screen here, that blue dotted line represents what we're showing as far as our decline of enrollment, or in this case, it's measured in the form of average daily attendance. Our average daily attendance is the true factor of how we calculate our funding. But as you can see with the downward slope, we're estimating that to decline fairly sharply between the current year and 2019-20. On the other side of the graph, I'm sharing with you is what we are receiving as far as funding for LCFF on a per student basis. The reason why I want to show it this way is because obviously we hear how much additional funding schools get. The additional funding schools get is a factor how much more they receive on a per student basis from one year to the next. So as an example, for this current year coming, 16-17, we will see an increase, our per pupil student increase per dollar. We're going to see about a 4.7% increase. It's about 60 some odd dollars more per student. But because we're going through that period of decline, we're not actually going to be receiving the full benefit of that increase, and it's just because of that decline. So that's the reason why I want to kind of show you this example here, is that, you know, if we were going through a period of time where we're increasing our students, yeah, we would be receiving that full benefit of the per student increase, but because we're declining, it's not quite that. So let me move on to the LCFF piece, and I'll further explain what I'm talking about. So what I'm showing you here is that LCFF target, the gap, and what our current funding level is. So at the top of the graph is what we refer to as the target. That is the restoration level back to 2007-08. So that is what we are constantly chasing when you think about it. The red portion is the gap between what target we're trying to achieve, and the green line represents what we're actually being funded on. And so as you can see there, that gap of 96.5% remaining, as I mentioned earlier. The LCFF target is going to continue to get a little bit more difficult to get closer to that target, depending upon, again, how much the legislature approves funding for LCFF, and whether or not, you know, there's a COLA involved. Excuse me.
What is 96.5? That's not the gap.
96.5 reflects how much of the gap has been filled.
Right, okay.
I'm sorry, correct.
Okay. So, okay.
So what I'm going to show you up here basically is the target continues to move as a result of COLA. The green portion represents what our base funding is. The blue lines represent what we're actually receiving as far as additional funds. So when I was talking about the funding per student, when I was saying that for 16-17 back here, we're seeing an increase of about 4.7% per child per funding based on the dollar increase. But because of the decline of enrollment, when you take into account the number of students that we have, we're actually only receiving about 3.82% in terms of new money. And it's just because of the decline of enrollment. And so as you look a little further down the road here with the further decline of enrollment, you can see where the forecast as far as additional funding through LCFF is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, despite the fact that, you know, there's a COLA of maybe 2%. We're only seeing barely a 1% increase projected over the next 3-4 years, and that is just because of the decline of enrollment. Let me stop for a second and see if there's any questions about this part so far.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. What you're saying basically is the amount of money that the district gets is a multiplier. So this per student number goes up, but the number of students goes down, and when you multiply the two together, that's what you get for the district.
Correct.
And so it's not, when you talk about the percentage that your budget increases, it's not necessarily the percentage that the state gives, it's the percentage that you get based on what your enrollment is times what the state gives.
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So with that, I'm just going to move through the rest of the presentation. The next several slides are just some graphs that kind of show you, how we're spending our money, where we're spending our money in particular areas. So first up this is everything. This is not only our district's general fund budget. This reflects all of our programs, whether it's our student nutrition program, it's our bond program, everything. So we're managing about $281 million of expenses going into this current year, and it's broken down this way. But when you only focus then on the general fund revenue is not quite $190 million. Most of our funding obviously comes from the state. roughly about 85, almost a little bit more than 85% of the budget comes from the state. 11.2% of our budget comes from local revenue, and that's primarily due to our parcel tax and our community. And thank you to our community for supporting the parcel taxes and their support of our schools with their donations, because it does represent a large portion of our budget. You can break out the revenue part of the budget between restricted and unrestricted. We still have, interesting enough, we still have some restricted funds. All of our federal funds are still considered restricted. We do have some. We do still have some state funds that are restricted in nature as well. So we separate those. As far as the breakdown of the budget, we break down our budget in the form of salaries. We break out certificated salaries, classified salaries, benefits, supplies and materials, services, capital outlay, and so forth. 86% of our budget is people, and that's generally where it typically is. Sometimes it could go as high as 90%. I've seen it in districts where they've come close to 90%. Here's a breakdown of the expenditure, both restricted and unrestricted. Here's another graph like we showed with the board in terms of how you could look at a budget to see how we're spending our money as far as the priorities. So this is a breakdown of functions. So we spend money on different functions such as instruction-related services, other student services, general admission, general administration, and costs to maintain the school from the plant services perspective. Again, 95% of our budget is spent on kids, and that's a very good indicator. Most districts should be in that 85 or higher range as far as spending their budget on students. And so now we're going to talk about the multi-year. So this is where I want to spend a little bit of time kind of updating the board on where we see ourselves in the next 3 years and even further out within 5 years. But for the coming year, 16-17, we're projecting that we will end the year meeting both our mandated 3% reserve requirement by the state and maintaining our board reserve level in addition to that, and that's reflective of the $11.5 million right here. We're showing the bottom, this undesignated, unappropriated amount as 0, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But we're showing you basically here a budget that is balanced. We're not deficit spending. Deficit spending means that we are not spending anything more in 1 year than we are receiving in the 1 year. So when you look at here, we're about $94,000 to the good as far as a positive budget. 17-18, I shared with you the assumptions. One of the things I want to point out, obviously, we've been talking about the continued increase in the cost of STIRS and PERS. So for 17-18, STIRS will increase up to 14.43%. PERS will increase up to 15.5%. So that then starts to have some impacts and effects on our budget. And also keep in mind that the budget, what you're seeing here, is reflective of the most recent salary settlements that the board had approved at the last board meeting. So what's reflective in here is the 5% ongoing in the salary schedule. So that's all factored in here as well. The budgets do not reflect any other salary considerations going forward subject to negotiation. So it doesn't factor anything other than normal step and column movements. But as I want to point out here, as we get looking at 17-18, what I was sharing with you a few minutes ago is that we're no longer, I guess we're now starting to deficit spend. So we're deficit spending here about $590,000 as I'm projecting here. Again, we're still able to maintain the board reserve on top of the 3%, and that bottom line shows that we don't have any thing left over. But one of the things, I don't know if you're seeing a trend here, this line here where I show fund balance reserves, we've been carrying those one-time dollars that we've been receiving as part of the one-time mandate. All the one-time dollars we've been showing there. And as we get further into the out years, you'll see that number, that line item, start to get a little smaller year after year after year. And we'll talk about why and what that will cause for us in the future. So it was about $11.5 million, $11.5 million in 16-17. It drops down to about $10.9 million in 17-18. I'm sorry, 17-18, 19-20, it drops down to $7.3 million.
Can you go back to the first slide?
Yes. 16-17 or 17-18? Okay. So what you're seeing as a trend is that our one-time monies are starting to draw down, and we knew that. We knew that as we were looking at the salary settlement. And then when you start looking at the overall incoming revenue and the expenditures year after year, we're starting to show where we're starting to deficit spend. So we're going into that kind of a mode. So 17-18 would then be the first year we're estimating right now that we're going to be deficit spending. And again, let me caveat here, deficit spending, what I'm sharing with you here is presuming that we spend everything in the budget. And obviously we don't spend every dollar when we close the books, but for purposes of what I need to show to you as far as the multi-year, I have to make an assumption here that we have an expenditure amount that we could carry forward so that we can measure ourselves over that 5-year period of time. So with that, 17-18 looks like that.
So, showing no balance on the undesignated and unappropriated, does that put us in some jeopardy with the rating that we get when we're audited by the county or by the state?
Phyllis, I guess, so the answer to your question is, what it will show is that our total ending fund balance will get smaller.
But it won't be a zero like it shows here.
Well, when you look at our final audited books, like for 17-18, I'm sorry, 16-17, it's going to show that we're going to have a total ending fund balance of $25,859. That's everything. That's including the reserve, that's including the one-time money. So that's usually the number that the rating agencies would be using to rate us, is how much is our ending fund balances.
Okay. All right.
But the challenge will be is that number is going to get smaller.
Thank you.
So for 19-20, the theme continues. The deficit spending continues to increase. It's estimated to be about $3.4 million. The one-time monies further get reduced, but we're still able to maintain our 3% reserve and our board reserve. So when you look at 3 years, I mean, we're fine. We're fine. We're there. But in the 3rd year, you start to see that there are some signs here that we have to start making some corrections here, because as we continue to deficit spend, because we're spending more than we're receiving, it will reach a point where that starts to then encroach further into that ending fund balance that Phyllis was referring to. Because you can see here by 19-20, what was a $25 million ending fund balance in 2016 now has dropped down to $21.7 million. So we've reduced, over that 3 years, we've reduced our ending fund balance by close to $4 million. And it's because of the deficit spending. But if it wasn't for the fact that we had the one-time dollars, obviously it would have happened sooner. But let me stop here, just to make sure everyone's following along here, because I think the board would be curious then to find out what does that look like beyond the 3 years. And so at the board's request at the last few meetings, the board had asked us to provide a 5-year picture. Oh, I just wanted to show here. So I showed you on the slide those 3 years that we're starting to deficit spend. So here's what that 5-year picture looks like. So the 5-year picture continues to show what I was saying to the board. We're projected to deficit spend, assuming everything remains the same, assuming what we're projecting as far as revenue, assuming what we're projecting as far as the decline of enrollment, we're projecting to spend, deficits as much as $6 million when you go all the way out to 2021. And then obviously keep in mind, this does not factor in anything from a negotiation standpoint, any changes with salaries, going beyond 16, actually going beyond this year. But I want to point out the other thing is that when you look at 2021, because we're showing that we're deficit spending close to $6 million, that would be the first year that we may have to drop into that board reserve level. We can surely meet the 3% reserve requirement by education code, but to be able to cover the projected expenditures for that year, we would have to touch that board reserve level. So maybe the message here is this gives us the time to think about what we need to do so that when that time comes, we'll have a plan, we will have some actions to take care of, or not take care of, but make sure we don't end up in a situation where we're dipping into the board reserve level.
So Chris, I just want to clarify, because a significant portion of the increase that we're seeing is due to the governor's decision to ask districts to pick up the additional retirement costs. And the
Yes.
retirement funds in the state were insolvent, and he had a choice of asking who should pay for that. The state could have done it, you could have dumped it all on employees, or you could put it on employers. And the governor decided
To do that.
employers
Correct.
was where.
Well, actually, the employees are
A
also
little bit,
picking up a
yeah,
share as well.
upper, 1 or 2%.
Mhm.
Districts went from 8% of employee costs to 18% of employee costs, and that's huge.
Mhm.
And I think it's important for everyone to remember that 30% of the money that we're being restored in terms of LCFF is going directly into retirement costs, and that's
a big
part of
piece.
this issue.
Correct, it's a big piece. I mean, when you think about it on a scale of magnitude, as far, when we see the year-to-year increases with the stirs and PERS, currently now it's about $1.5 million. So it's about a $1.5 million increase on top of the current years to bring it up to the new rate. And that continues all the way up to the 18, almost 19% level. So it's actually projected to go just 1 year beyond 2021. So that $1.5 million each year is reflective, when you look at it in terms of what that means in terms of salary for our district, it's a little bit more than 1%. So that's something that we have to think about. And then also think about this, right? When we're finally restored back to our pre-recession levels, right? We're back to COLA. We're no longer getting these huge infusions of dollars under the LCFF because we will have been restored back to that target. And then from that point forward, our funding is just based upon whatever the state COLA is. So this year is 0. I mean, if the stirs and PERS increase, is about, a $1.5 million, and we don't get any form of increase in COLA, that's the problem. And that's what I think a lot of people are saying right now, is that when you look at it, how it's not fair is that those increased costs of stirs and PERS, the COLA, the projected COLA is not going to be enough, barely enough to cover those future increases. So that's something we have to be aware of, because those are considered fixed costs as far as the budget goes. Those are costs that we're going to have to incur, and unless there's additional funding from the state.
And that's an issue that every district in the state's going to have to deal with.
Yes.
And I think the biggest dilemma is, districts look at budget in 3-year increments. And last year, the problem was 5 years out. So the fact that we actually looked at it and at least could see it, I think is helpful. I know there are a lot of districts that just look at year 3. And one more thing I just want to say, I just want to commend the district and us, a little pat on the back, for being willing to put money in reserves when we had it, knowing that we're going to have a time when the recession's going to hit us back and we're going to have increased costs, and that we have something put aside for that. I wish the state would do a better job of that as well. So, Phyllis.
I just wanted to talk, I know that when you get out to the out years to 2021, you kind of have to have a crystal ball, so this is your best guess, and I appreciate that, Chris. I think when we decided to do the district reserve, it was kind of the rainy day fund. And I don't know exactly what a rainy day is, but this looks like one to me. But one of the things we said then was that we never wanted to have furlough days again. And we never wanted the community to have to go out in 8 weeks and raise $2.5 million again. So, so I think we have to look carefully in the out years at what we do and how we dip into that reserve.
No, and I think I commend the board for taking the position that you did back then. And again, we don't have a crystal ball, but I mean, knowing that this could be a potential that we have to deal with, it gives us some time. It gives us some time to plan for this, because as we know, I mean, just with the decline of enrollment, we have to make some budget adjustments just due to that. But when we start looking at, again, we're seeing such a large decline in certain areas of our district, it creates further challenges. So those are some of the things too we have to think about, we have to look at going forward here. But I think again, if the plan should be to do whatever we need to continue to manage the rainy day fund and try to stay ahead of the future cost increases, especially with stirs and PERS. But I think the challenge will be for us is negotiations. Because when you look at it here, what I'm showing you, every new dollar that we're projecting right now based on these assumptions have been committed to these current ongoing expenses. So if we go, in the future, go back and we negotiate and we're able to, offer a settlement to our employees, that continues to add additional costs to that ongoing commitment. And so we just have to be cognizant of the fact that, right now, unless we're getting more money than what we're projecting right now, we have just enough to make sure we maintain what we have. Okay, so just kind of moving on, the other part of the budget, we want to make sure that we're mindful of is the programs that do not receive hardly enough funding either from the federal government or the state government. So like transportation, we provide transportation for some parts of our regular population, and we obviously provide transportation for our special needs children that have that need in their IEPs. So right now, transportation requires an additional contribution from the general fund, a little bit more than $2 million. That's up from about $1.8 million this year. Special ed, speaking about special ed, the encroachment now is $18.7 million, up from 16.5. So that's something too, again, we need to be mindful of as well. And as well as our routine repair budget, I think we're now funding at the required level. For a while there, under the Tier 3 flexibility, we had the ability to not fund it at its full level, given the fact that with the budget challenges. I think we are at our current level that we need to fund it. So when you look at that, that's about $26 million out of our $189 million budget that's going to support just these 3 programs here. One other thing, we came back from the school services workshop, something to be thinking of. There's a proposal out there to make some changes around early childhood education. There's this concept of creating this early education block grant to address preschool for all, I guess it's for all children, but the caveat is they're focusing on the neediest 4-year-olds in the system. But one of the things that caught our attention was that there were some references to eliminating, and that's what I think I took away, was eliminating TK, or transitional kinder. So that's something I think we have to be, obviously thinking about, because that's something that we've invested in this district. And if the state is talking about creating some new program here, it's going to have some impacts on what is it that we do as far as providing a TK experience for children. So I just want to put that out there. That's something that it hasn't been, nothing's been passed yet, but it's part of, I guess it's part of his proposal going forward. So just to wrap things up, these are the things that we just have to be aware of. We started off talking about, we're in the middle of a potential slowdown. I would venture to say we're on the possible verge of a recession, and so we need to try to stay ahead of that. But I think more importantly, it's the Proposition 30 impact. I'm hopeful, I believe there is a measure being proposed for the November election. Should that pass, that's wonderful, that's great, that probably gives us a temporary reprieve as far as this goes, but you know, those taxes, those temporary taxes eventually go away.
And the Prop 30 extension, make sure I understand correctly, doesn't give us any new money, it just keeps us from losing money. So it's just like
Yes.
before, it keeps you from losing more, it keeps you from having to make cuts, but it doesn't give
Yes.
you anything to grow.
No, it's no additional funding, and it's with the stipulation that if it doesn't pass, they'll cut us. And so that's how it was sold to us the first time. Challenges I mentioned about negotiation. Again, anything new coming forward right now, we're showing on the multi-year is going to be committed to those ongoing costs. The PERS and STIRS cost, at full implementation, STIRS is supposed to get to that 19.1 level, and PERS almost 20%. Continued enrollment decline. That's something that we need to continue to look at those. The cost of health insurance continues to be a concern. I know with the new minimum wage laws, we have to factor that in as well. And then I just put up there, maintaining that board reserve level. I think it's important that we just get that out there, because if we wait until 2021 to then talk about what to do, it will have obviously been too late. So I wanted to put that up there so that we know that we need to do something in advance of that to deal with that. Next steps, you know, I'm going to say it right here. You know, we're going to have to look at some reductions on the horizon. You know, we could wait. We can wait until 2018, 19 to do all that. But I would think that we ought to be looking before 2018, 19 to start looking at what we can do. Whether any ongoing dollars we can save tomorrow will help reduce what we need to reduce by the time that comes. And then obviously look at the encroachments, continue to monitor the encroachments. So that's all I had planned to share with the board on the budget.
So, Phyllis, and then anyone else?
Yeah, I just have a question about the necessary reductions on the horizon. Are you going to begin discussions anytime soon with the Budget Advisory Committee about how they feel about that, or?
We meet tomorrow.
Question answered, thank you.
I have a question about the LCFF target. So when I take a look, the slide from last year
Mm-hmm.
is different and it's much lower. So does that because it's reflecting the COLA percentage, or?
Let me go back to that slide. I'll go through that again.
Yeah.
This one.
This one.
Okay.
So this one, the LCFF target was 146, 144, 145,
Mhm.
146, and 148. And when I took a look
Last year.
last year, and some year is over 150.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference is because the COLA percentage, or?
Yeah, so, well, in the current year, it will always be based on that year's enrollment, that year's COLA. But when I project out the following years, that number is a factor of what we estimate the COLA to be and what we estimate the number of students that we have. So that number is that floating target. It depends on if the COLA comes in higher or lower than what we projected. So we typically see a COLA projection for the next 5 years. But when the governor comes out in January to share with us what the budget is for the coming year, at that time we know what the COLA is, because that's what they're setting the budget on. So we validate that COLA number in January for the coming year's budget. So what we've shown in the past, actually what I've shown you on this graph for the years outside of the current year have just been based on those estimate COLA numbers. Because as I shared with you, back in January, when I presented to you like first and second interim, I showed you a snapshot of what 2017-18 looked like. Back then, we were estimating the COLA to be about 2%. Now the estimates dropped down to that 1.11. So that drops that black line down because of that.
So if there is a possibility, probably will getting lower. That's what
Well, that black line, that
Right.
number,
Right.
that number will go down. The only way it will go down on us is the number of students that we have continues to drop.
Okay.
Because that number is a factor of how many students we have.
But that also affect the green line as well, the students' number.
Correct. Well, how much funding we're getting is reflective of the green line.
Right,
What we actually get, because it's also tied to how many students.
right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, no, good question.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Someone?
No, I don't have any questions yet, thank you, and thank you to Julia and her team.
Thank you.